$44,600,000. That is the exact price one dinosaur skeleton sold for inside a New York auction house, the most money ever paid for a fossil in human history. What the buyer received was the most complete Stegosaurus skeleton ever pulled from the ground. Real bone, real skin impressions, even preserved throat cartilage, intact after 150 million years. And in the time since that sale, the single most expensive dinosaur fossil on Earth has done something almost no other major discovery in the history of paleontology has done. It still does not have an official species name. It has not been formally described in a single peer-reviewed scientific paper. The most valuable fossil ever sold is also, by the rules science itself runs on, one of the least usable specimens of its kind in existence right now. And the reason has nothing to do with the bones themselves. Something 27 feet long once moved slowly across a floodplain in what would one day become Colorado, a row of bony plates running down its spine, a spiked tail swinging behind it with enough force to break bone. It was not hunting anything. It did not need to. Stegosaurus spent the late Jurassic as one of the most successful herbivores on the planet, its fossils eventually turning up across North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. This particular animal lived long enough to develop arthritis. Its bones show no trace of a fatal wound, no marks from a predator's teeth, no evidence it was ever scavenged after death. It simply lived a long life and died of something time-worn skeletons don't preserve. Then, 150 million years later, in 2022, someone finally found it. In May of 2022, a commercial paleontologist named Jason Cooper was working his own private land in Moffat County, Colorado, near a town that is, fittingly, actually named Dinosaur. He found the specimen encased in sandstone, with no other fossils nearby, part of the Morrison formation that has produced dinosaur discoveries since the 1880s. Excavation ran until October of 2023. What came out of the ground was, by any measure paleontology uses, extraordinary. 254 individual fossil bone elements out of an estimated 319 the animal would have had in life, roughly 80% complete. It remains the largest and most complete Stegosaurus skeleton ever discovered, more than 30% bigger than Sotheby, the specimen that had held that record at London's Natural History Museum. It stood 11 feet tall and stretched nearly 27 feet from nose to tail, with skin impressions and throat structures called ossicles preserved well enough to study directly. Cooper named it Apex. If you are finding this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. Completeness. Like that matters enormously to a specific branch of paleontology, bone histology, the study of growth rings preserved inside fossilized bone. Researchers studying earlier Stegosaurus specimens in a landmark 2009 study cut thin cross-sections from limb bones and examined them under a microscope, revealing bands called lines of arrested growth, essentially the same annual growth rings found in a tree trunk. That work established something genuinely surprising. Stegosaurus grew unusually slowly compared to most other dinosaurs its size, and the shift from fast juvenile growth to slower adult growth, visible directly in the bone's internal structure, marks the point an individual reached sexual maturity. A follow-up study in 2012 applied the same method to Stegosaurus plates and spikes, CT scanning and thin sectioning them to track how those structures changed with age. Apex already shows visible arthritis, meaning it was almost certainly an old adult when it died. A histological sample from its bones could pin down exactly how old, using the single best preserved skeleton of this species ever recovered. There is a catch built into that kind of research, one that has nothing to do with Stegosaurus biology. Bone histology is destructive. Producing a usable thin section means physically cutting a small sample out of an irreplaceable fossil, a decision no researcher can make unilaterally. It requires the explicit authorization of whoever legally owns the specimen, because the cut cannot be undone. Museums that own their own specimens outright grant this kind of permission routinely. as ordinary scientific practice. A specimen on a temporary loan is a different situation entirely. Sotheby's placed Apex at auction on July 17, 2024, with a pre-sale estimate of $4 million to $6 million. 7 bidders competed for 15 minutes, pushing the hammer price to roughly $40 million before buyers' fees were added, for a final total of $44.6 million, roughly 11 times the high estimate. It became the most expensive fossil ever sold at auction anywhere, surpassing the previous record of $31.8 million paid for a Tyrannosaurus rex named Stan in 2020, a skeleton that later became the centerpiece of a new natural history museum in Abu Dhabi. Apex's sale would take a different path entirely. The buyer was revealed the following day: Kenneth Griffin, founder and chief executive of the hedge fund Citadel, a collector already known for spending enormous sums on art and then loaning it to public institutions rather than keeping it purely private. Apex was born in America and is going to stay in America, Griffin said after the sale. He announced he intended to loan the skeleton to a public institution, and in December of 2024, Apex went on exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, opening to the public on December 8th on a loan scheduled to run for 4 years. By every visible measure, that sounds like a happy ending. Millions of museum visitors can now walk up to the most complete Stegosaurus skeleton ever found. And yet, more than a year after that unveiling, Apex still carries no species name and no formal scientific description, exactly the gap mentioned at the start of this story. For an animal this complete, potentially the single best specimen available anywhere to finally resolve open questions about Stegosaurus anatomy and growth, that gap is not an accident. It is the direct result of how Apex was acquired. The core issue is a principle the scientific community treats as close to non-negotiable: reproducibility. Formal taxonomic science, the kind that assigns an official species name and publishes it in a peer-reviewed journal, requires that the specimen underlying the description remain permanently and reliably accessible, so any future researcher can go back, re-examine the original bones, and, when needed, take the kind of physical sample that histology requires. A specimen owned by a private individual cannot guarantee any of that, no matter how completely it is displayed to the public in the meantime. Griffin's loan to the museum is exactly that: a loan. Apex remains, legally, Griffin's property. Museum researchers cannot authorize cutting into it the way they could authorize cutting into a specimen the museum actually owns, and there is no binding guarantee the skeleton will still be there to sample at all once the 4-year loan ends, or that it will not be sold again, moved into a private residence, or withdrawn from public view entirely before then. The Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, the leading professional association in the field, founded in 1940 and representing more than 2,000 paleontologists worldwide, addressed this directly. On June 18, 2025, the Society sent a formal letter to the American Museum of Natural History's leadership, criticizing the absence of any binding agreement guaranteeing long-term research access to Apex, and warning that studying a loaned, privately owned fossil could incentivize exactly the kind of high-dollar private sale that produced Apex in the first place. Stuart Sumida, the Society's president, called it a genuinely new gray area for the field, one the organization was still working through rather than one it already had settled rules for. Subscribe to not miss the next one. The contrast with an earlier, similarly famous specimen makes the stakes clear. In 1997, a Tyrannosaurus rex nicknamed Sui sold at auction for $8,360,000, purchased outright by Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History, with the acquisition partly funded by corporate donors, including McDonald's and Disney. Because that sale transferred Sui permanently into public institutional ownership, museum scientists have had standing authority to sample her for nearly 3 decades. CT scanning the skull, sectioning bone for histology, running isotopic analysis, the same destructive and semi-destructive techniques that could answer Apex's open questions. Sue has been physically sampled and published on repeatedly, precisely because the institution that owns her can authorize that work without asking anyone's permission. Apex, despite being arguably more complete, cannot currently offer that same guarantee because Apex was never purchased by an institution at all. It was purchased by one individual and then generously, but only temporarily, shared. This is not a hypothetical concern invented after the fact. Paleontologists raised it before the auction even happened. In May of 2024, paleontologist Steve Brussati pointed out that Stegosaurus fossils are considerably rarer in the fossil record than other iconic dinosaurs like Triceratops or Tyrannosaurus, arguing precisely because of that rarity that a specimen like this belonged in a museum from the outset, rather than entering a bidding war among private collectors first. That is exactly what happened anyway. Sotheby's own listing did not assign Apex to a specific species within the Stegosaurus genus, and at least one paleontologist who reviewed the sale, Diego Garcia Bellido, noted the ambiguity could reflect either genuinely incomplete scientific examination or a deliberate choice to withhold detailed identification ahead of a sale expected to fetch millions. None of this means Apex's scientific value has vanished. The bones themselves have not changed. The arthritis, the completeness, the preserved skin impressions and throat ossicles are all still there, sitting inside a climate-controlled hall in Manhattan, viewed by an enormous public audience every single day. What has changed is whether the formal scientific process built around peer review, reproducibility, and physical access can fully engage with that specimen the way it has with Sue for 28 years and counting. As of now, it cannot, not with the confidence that comes from knowing a fossil will still be sitting in the same institution decades from now, whenever the next generation of scientific tools arrives to ask it new questions. The most complete Stegosaurus skeleton ever pulled from the ground sold for $44,600,000 in a 15-minute bidding war, went on public display within 5 months, and still does not have an official name. Millions of people have now stood in front of it, close enough to count individual bones through the glass. The scientific community, by its own published standards, is still waiting for permission to actually sample it, and until an institution owns Apex, the way the Field Museum owns Sue, that permission may never formally arrive. The most valuable dinosaur fossil in history sits in one of the most visited museums on Earth, fully lit, fully mounted, and functionally untouchable by the one process that could ever tell the world exactly what it actually was.